for generations. The world accepted one simple belief. America grew the food. Africa bought it. But what happens when that story begins to change? While American farmers face shrinking export markets, rising production costs, and growing uncertainty after years of global trade tensions, one small nation in West Africa is making a decision that could reshape its own agricultural future. Burkina Faso has chosen to protect its farmers by making imported food more expensive. To some economists, it looks risky. To many African farmers, it looks like freedom. If you believe every nation deserves the right to feed itself with dignity, press like, subscribe, and stay with us, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about food. It is a story about independence. Nearly 6,000 miles apart, two farmers wake before sunrise in Iowa. An aging soybean farmer walks across fields his family has worked for generations. Every season feels more uncertain than the last. Export demand has weakened. Costs continue to climb. He wonders how much longer the farm can survive. At almost the same moment, just outside Ouagadougou, a young Burkinabe farmer steps onto land that his father nearly abandoned years ago. This season feels different. For the first time in years, he believes locally grown food might finally compete with imported products. Two farmers, two continents, two very different futures. Neither of them controls global markets. Neither writes trade policy. But one government has decided to rewrite the rules that shape everyday life in the countryside. And that decision has sparked a debate reaching far beyond Burkina Faso. Could a single import tax become the beginning of Africa's agricultural awakening? Or is something even bigger quietly taking shape beneath the surface? Because once a nation decides to protect the people who grow its food, the next chapter becomes far more important than anyone expected. For years, imported food looked like a gift. The prices were lower. The supermarket shelves stayed full. Cities enjoyed affordable rice, wheat, frozen chicken, vegetable oil, and processed foods arriving from thousands of miles away. To many consumers, it seemed like progress. But beneath those lower prices, another story was quietly unfolding across Burkina Faso. Every bag of imported rice made it harder for local rice farmers to sell their harvest. Every truck carrying frozen poultry reduced demand for chickens raised by Burkinabe families. Every shipment of foreign vegetable oil pushed another local producer closer to closing their business. What looked inexpensive at the checkout counter carried a hidden cost in the countryside. Fields were abandoned. Young people left their villages looking for work in crowded cities. Parents began telling their children that farming no longer offered a future. Slowly, dependence replaced confidence. For decades, many African economists warned that this pattern created a dangerous imbalance. When a nation cannot produce enough of its own food, it becomes vulnerable to decisions made far beyond its borders. A drought overseas, a shipping crisis, a sudden rise in fuel prices, a global conflict. Any one of these events could suddenly make basic food more expensive for millions of families. That is the challenge Burkina Faso's leadership says it wants to confront. Instead of allowing imported products to dominate local markets indefinitely, the government has chosen a different direction. Imported food would face higher taxes. The purpose was straightforward: give local farmers a fairer opportunity to compete inside their own country. Support domestic production. Keep more agricultural income inside Burkina Faso. Reduce long-term dependence on imported food. To supporters, it was not a rejection of international trade. It was an attempt to rebalance it. The goal was not to stop buying food forever. The goal was to ensure that Burkinabe farmers could survive alongside imported products instead of being pushed out by them. The decision immediately divided opinion. Some business owners worried prices would increase. Urban families wondered whether food would become less affordable. Import companies questioned whether supply chains would be disrupted. Yet outside the major cities, the conversation sounded very different. In a farming village near Bobo Dioulasso, elders gathered beneath a large tree after hearing the announcement. One farmer looked across his fields and quietly smiled. "If imported rice is no longer the cheapest choice," he said, "perhaps my grandchildren will stay here instead of leaving." His words were simple, but they reflected something much larger than economics. They reflected hope. Across rural communities, Farmers began asking questions they had not asked in years. Should we plant more next season? Should we repair the irrigation canal? Should we invest in better storage? Could farming finally become a business worth expanding again? Local cooperatives started discussing larger harvest targets. Small equipment repair shops prepared for increased demand. Young graduates studying agriculture began wondering whether their future might exist at home instead of abroad. The policy had not changed a single harvest overnight, but it had changed expectations. And expectations often shape investment long before results appear. The contrast with the United States made the discussion even more striking. American agriculture remains among the most productive in the world. Yet many producers have faced significant challenges in recent years, including changing export markets, higher production costs, weather pressures, and the effects of international trade disputes. In both countries, farmers wanted the same thing: a fair opportunity to compete. The difference was how each government attempted to respond. One continued searching for larger export markets. The other focused on strengthening the domestic market first. Neither path guaranteed success, but Burkina Faso had clearly chosen its direction. Many African observers saw something deeper than an economic policy. They saw the beginning of a different philosophy: food security before dependency, local production before unlimited imports, national resilience before short-term convenience. For the first time in many years, conversations across village markets were no longer centered only on surviving the next season. People began talking about building the next generation, and that is where Ibrahim Traoré introduced an even broader vision. The import tax was never meant to stand alone. It was only the first move. The government paired it with investments in irrigation projects, support for local producers, expanded agricultural training, storage facilities, and efforts to strengthen food production across the country. The message was becoming clearer. Protecting farmers was not enough. They also needed the tools to succeed. Agricultural engineers traveled into rural communities, demonstrating improved planting methods. Local cooperatives received guidance on post-harvest storage to reduce food losses. Discussions expanded beyond simply growing crops. People began talking about processing food locally, creating jobs before products ever reached the marketplace. Young entrepreneurs started exploring rice milling, tomato processing, cooking oil production, and food packaging. Instead of exporting opportunity, they wanted to create it at home. For many young Africans, this represented a different kind of patriotism, not one built on speeches, one built on planting, harvesting, producing, and feeding their own communities. Across social media, conversations reflected growing optimism. If we grow more, we buy less. If we process our own food, we keep more value. If farmers succeed, entire villages succeed. The discussion was no longer limited to Burkina Faso. Analysts in neighboring Mali and Niger began asking whether similar strategies could strengthen their own agricultural sectors. Could protecting local producers create stronger rural economies? Could greater food self-sufficiency reduce vulnerability to external shocks? Could regional cooperation eventually strengthen agricultural trade across the Sahel? No one knew the answers. But one thing was becoming impossible to ignore. A policy that began as an import tax was slowly turning into a broader conversation about economic sovereignty. And if one nation could change the way it valued its own farmers, how long would it be before others began asking whether they should do the same? By the second planting season, something far more important than crop prices had begun to change. People were changing. Across Burkina Faso, the conversation was no longer centered on what arrived at the ports. It was centered on what could be grown at home. In village markets outside Ouagadougou, more stalls began displaying locally produced rice, maize, onions, tomatoes, peanuts, and millet. Customers noticed something unexpected. Buying local no longer felt like settling for less. It felt like investing in their own future. An elderly woman selling rice in Koudougou smiled as regular customers returned to her small wooden stand. For years, many had chosen cheaper imported rice. Now they stopped to ask a different question. Was this grown here? When she answered yes, many chose her rice, not because it was perfect, but because every purchase helped another Burkinabe family remain on their land Nearby, a young father loaded sacks of locally grown maize onto an old motorcycle. Only 2 years earlier, he had planned to leave for work abroad. Now he was expanding his family's farm instead. My children, he said quietly, should inherit a business, not an empty field. Stories like these spread from village to village. One successful harvest inspired another. One repaired irrigation canal encouraged neighboring communities to organize their own projects. One profitable farming season convinced another family to return home. Economic change had begun creating psychological change. Perhaps that was the biggest transformation of all. For decades, many Africans had been told that development would always arrive from somewhere else. Investment would come from somewhere else. Technology would come from somewhere else. Food would come from somewhere else. Now, another idea was quietly taking root. Perhaps development could begin at home. Perhaps the next generation of prosperity would grow from African soil itself. That belief spread faster than any government announcement. Agricultural students discussed building food processing companies instead of seeking jobs overseas. Young engineers designed low-cost irrigation systems adapted to local conditions. Women's cooperatives expanded vegetable production using shared equipment and community savings. Village leaders encouraged families to organize seed banks and improve storage rather than waiting for outside assistance. The transformation was becoming cultural, not just economic. Many observers noticed something else. The language had changed. People spoke less about dependency, more about capability, less about receiving, more about producing, less about surviving, more about building. And once people begin believing they can build their own future, history often moves in unexpected directions. That growing confidence did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Neighboring countries were watching closely. In Mali, agricultural organizations discussed how stronger protection for local producers might encourage greater investment in domestic farming. In Niger, community leaders debated ways to strengthen food production while reducing exposure to international supply disruptions. Across the alliance of Sahel states, economists began discussing a larger possibility. What if neighboring countries coordinated agricultural policy instead of competing against one another? Imagine farmers in Burkina Faso supplying processed food to regional markets. Imagine livestock from Niger supporting local food industries. Imagine grain production expanding across Mali while transportation corridors connected producers directly to consumers throughout the region. Instead of importing more food from overseas, Africa could increasingly trade with itself. That possibility represented far more than economics. It represented resilience. Every shipment traded within Africa would keep more value inside African economies. Every new food processing facility would create local jobs before products ever crossed a border. Every successful harvest would strengthen rural communities instead of encouraging migration away from them. Many analysts believe this is where Ibrahim Traoré's broader vision begins to emerge, not simply protecting one country's farmers, but encouraging a model in which African nations create stronger regional value chains, produce locally, process locally, trade regionally, grow together. If that vision succeeds, Burkina Faso would not stand alone. It could become part of a wider agricultural transformation across the continent. Naturally, international observers are paying close attention. Some economists argue that greater domestic food production can improve long-term resilience. Others caution that higher import barriers may also increase consumer prices if local production cannot expand quickly enough. Business leaders continue debating how to balance food security, affordability, and international trade. These are legitimate questions. Every country faces difficult choices when designing agricultural policy. Yet from the perspective of many rural families in Burkina Faso, the debate feels much more personal. They are not arguing about economic theories. They are asking whether their children will still be farming 20 years from now, whether villages will remain alive, whether agriculture can once again become a source of pride instead of hardship, and perhaps that explains why this conversation continues growing across Africa. Because for many people, protecting farmers is not only about today's harvest, it is about protecting tomorrow's independence. Still, one question remains unanswered. If Burkina Faso succeeds in rebuilding its agricultural economy, what happens when more African nations begin following the same path? Could this become the foundation of a new era of African trade? Or will powerful economic interests attempt to preserve the old system before that future has the chance to grow? By now, one thing had become increasingly clear. The import tax was never the destination. It was only the opening move. If Burkina Faso truly wanted to transform its agricultural economy, protecting farmers would not be enough. The next challenge would be helping them compete. Across the country, discussions began shifting toward a larger vision. How do you keep more value inside Burkina Faso instead of exporting raw harvests? The answer, many believed, was to build the entire agricultural chain, not just growing rice, milling it, not just harvesting tomatoes, processing them, not just producing peanuts, turning them into cooking oil, packaged foods, and products carrying the words "Made in Burkina Faso." Each additional step meant more jobs, more skills, more businesses, and more young people choosing to stay instead of leaving. Agricultural economists often point to a simple reality. Countries rarely become prosperous by exporting raw materials alone. They create greater value when they process those materials before selling them. Many supporters believe the same principle applies to agriculture. If Burkina Faso can harvest, process, package, and market its own food, far more income remains inside the national economy. That possibility explains why many observers expect the next phase of reform to focus on rural infrastructure, better storage facilities, cold chain logistics, food processing plants, agricultural credit, modern irrigation, vocational training, digital marketplaces connecting farmers directly with buyers. None of these changes happen overnight, but together, they begin creating something stronger than a single policy. They create an ecosystem. Across Burkina Faso, many young entrepreneurs are already imagining where they might fit into that future. One dreams of opening a rice mill. Another wants to manufacture irrigation equipment. A university graduate studies food science, hoping to reduce post-harvest losses. A cooperative of women expands vegetable processing to supply nearby schools and hospitals. Every new idea adds another small piece to a much larger transformation. Many citizens now believe that agriculture should no longer be seen as the country's past. It could become one of its greatest opportunities. That confidence may prove just as valuable as any financial investment, because economic growth often begins with something difficult to measure. Belief. Belief that effort will be rewarded. Belief that markets will exist. Belief that the next generation can build a better future without leaving home. Yet the story extends far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, governments continue searching for ways to strengthen food security while creating sustainable economic growth. Some prioritize expanding international trade, others focus on increasing domestic production. Many pursue a balance between the two. Burkina Faso's approach has become part of that larger conversation, not because every country will choose the same policy, but because it raises an important question: how much food security should a nation produce for itself? And how much should it depend on the global market? Those questions are becoming more important as climate pressures, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical uncertainty continue shaping international trade. Meanwhile, the United States continues adapting to its own agricultural challenges. American farmers remain among the most productive in the world, yet they also face changing export markets, higher operating costs, labor shortages in some regions, and increasing competition abroad. Both Burkina Faso and the United States are trying to secure the future of their agricultural sectors. They are simply taking different paths toward that goal. One emphasizes global competitiveness. The other places greater emphasis on strengthening domestic resilience. History will determine which approaches prove most effective under changing global conditions. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson is not about tariffs at all. It is about confidence. For generations, Africa was often viewed primarily as a market for food produced somewhere else. Today, more Africans are asking a different question. Why shouldn't Africa become one of the world's great food producers? Why shouldn't African farmers feed African families? Why shouldn't African businesses process African harvests? Why shouldn't African trade create African prosperity? Those questions are larger than Burkina Faso. They belong to an entire continent. They also remind the world that agriculture is about much more than economics. Gold creates wealth. Oil creates influence. Technology creates opportunity, but food creates security. A nation that can reliably feed its people possesses a form of strength that cannot easily be measured on financial charts. Perhaps that is why this conversation resonates so deeply across Africa today, because beneath every discussion about tariffs, imports, and trade lies a much older human truth. Every family wants to place food on the table with dignity. Every farmer wants the chance to compete fairly. Every nation hopes to build a future that rests on its own foundations rather than permanent dependence. Whether Burkina Faso's strategy ultimately succeeds will depend on many factors: investment, infrastructure, weather, regional cooperation, private enterprise, good governance, the determination of millions of farmers. The outcome has not yet been written, but one thing is already visible: the conversation has changed. Across villages, universities, businesses, and government offices, people are no longer asking whether Africa can transform its agricultural future. They are asking how quickly that transformation can happen. And perhaps that is the most significant change of all, because history often begins changing long before the numbers do. It begins the moment people believe that a different future is possible. If Africa continues investing in its farmers, strengthening regional trade, and building value at home, the next generation may inherit something far greater than higher harvests. They may inherit greater resilience, greater opportunity, and greater confidence in their own ability to shape the continent's future. So now we leave you with one final question. If protecting local farmers today could strengthen Africa's economy tomorrow, what should be the next priority? Better irrigation? Food processing industries? Regional agricultural trade? Or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this analysis, press like, subscribe, and join us for more thoughtful discussions on Africa's changing economic landscape. Because some of history's biggest revolutions do not begin with armies. They begin with farmers. They begin with fields. And sometimes they begin with one country deciding that the future of its people is worth growing at home.